Good evening. Looks like spring, huh? Somewhere. I'm Ellen Levy. I'm the chair of the Great Decisions Committee, as most of you know from week to week in February, March, and I'm a board member of the World Affairs Council of Western Michigan. Tonight we're beginning the second half of the Great Decisions Foreign Policy Series, and for March we have an additional way to participate in Great Decisions. In addition to Monday night in this auditorium, our speakers will also present on Tuesday at 11 a.m. at the Fifth Third Bank Building in downtown Grand Rapids. So if you are interested in that, please look at our brochure for more details. If you're currently not a member, you can join for as little as $10 a year. If you join after the program tonight, we'll give you a $5 credit towards your membership. Stop by the table in the lobby on your way out. And if you'd just like to have your name on our email list without becoming a member, please stop by the table as well and we'll get your details. Our ballot box has not been very full lately. So I'm hopeful that tonight you will just stuff that ballot box. I know we're not supposed to do that, but if you have a lot to say and you want to give your opinion, we'd love to hear from you. If you miss the box, please hand your ballot to me or to Dixie or to a staff member on your way out. As I've mentioned before, the results of these ballots go to Congress, the State Department, and the White House. Now, tonight we're not using the armchair discussion format because our speaker wants to get audience questions as soon as possible. So please be preparing your questions as he's speaking, and don't be shy about coming down to the microphones. I noticed this one's moved a little bit this way this week, and the other one is where it has been. Also, please text your question to the phone number in the program if you don't feel like coming down the steps. I want to make a note tonight that the number is different than it is in the program. So if you're interested in texting, the number for tonight is 616-292-7387. 616-292-7387. We're very, very pleased to welcome back to Grand Rapids Reza Marashi from the National Iranian American Council. Reza spoke to our World Affairs Council audience during our fall lecture series of 2012. We had such positive feedback from his presentation and engagement with the audience, as well as audience requests to bring him back, that we knew we just had to do that. And from my brief discussion with Reza tonight, I'm sure you're going to really enjoy his talk. He's very engaging and very lively. He'll walk us through the precarious issue this evening of the red line, Iran, Israel, and the bomb. Please join me in welcoming Reza Marashi.
Thanks, everybody, for having me. Can you all hear me okay? Yeah? Thumbs up? Okay, great. Now, talking about Israel and Iran means that I'm going to be giving a lecture tonight that not everybody in the room is going to agree with. I think that goes without saying. But that's the best part, because if I walked into a room and gave a lecture that you all were going to agree with, then I wouldn't be doing my job, right? And I don't work for the U.S. government anymore, so I can speak a little bit more candidly than people who are in government can, because the rules of the game are that when you are inside those four walls of a government building, the conversation is free-flowing, anything goes. But when you step outside of those four walls of a government building, you toe the line, even if you don't agree with it. I worked for the Bush administration, didn't agree with a lot of things they had to say. Worked for the Obama administration, didn't agree with a lot of things they had to say. But whenever I would leave the Department of State and speak publicly about what our policy was, I had to take the talking points and sell them as if they were my own. That's what we do. But I'm not doing that tonight. Tonight we're going to speak candidly about Israel, Iran, and the bomb. More specifically, what we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about why the United States and why Israel see the progression of Iran's nuclear program as dangerous to their respective interests. And then after we talk a little bit about that, we're going to talk about why it's been so difficult for Iran to be able to reach a deal year after year after year. There are a couple of factors that go into both of these subsets, if you will. So we're going to walk through them. There's no way to cover everything because this could be a book in and of itself, and Lord knows there's been multiple books written about the subject. But hopefully when we get to the Q&A, you guys will be able to ask me some of the things that you have on your mind, and we can really get to the heart of the issue, because one of the best things about doing this is I'm in this bubble called Washington, D.C., right? So I'm having conversations with people who do what I do for a living every day. And what happens when you do that? You end up looking like Congress at the end of the day, where you have a bunch of people who aren't agreeing with each other on anything. But when I come out here and I do these kinds of things in Pittsburgh, Houston, Grand Rapids, Sacramento, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Chicago, and everywhere in between, universities, world affairs councils, I get to hear from you guys, to hear what you think about the issues that I work on day in and day out. So that helps me focus in on what I need to present and how to present it better, because at the end of the day, these issues on a day-to-day basis don't necessarily come across as, shall I say, digestible to the average American. It's the job of those of us who do this for a living to make it more digestible. So hopefully that's a little bit, at least a little bit of what I'm going to do tonight. So let's start talking about the United States and Israel and how they see this Iran nuclear program. Why is it an outstanding issue? Why do both countries consider it to be a threat to their respective national security interests? Just because they each agree, just because Tel Aviv and Washington agree that this issue is a threat, it doesn't mean that they perceive the threat the same way. In fact, even though they agree that it's a threat, they perceive the threat in very different ways. And I want to walk you through both of the ways as it's been explained to me by my former colleagues in the US government and current and former Israeli officials. I was in Israel in September, having these kinds of discussions. And we can walk through it a little bit. From the American side, first there's the obvious. The spread of nuclear weapons is extremely dangerous to world peace. There's no doubt about it. I don't think too many people will argue against the fact that more of the most destructive weapons known in the history of mankind is not necessarily a good thing. But when we get past the obvious, things get a little bit trickier. What do I mean by that? Well, let's go back to World War II. Let's do a little bit of a history lesson, because what's past is prologue. If you go to the Department of Justice in Washington, D.C., that's inscribed on the wall, on the outside. That's Shakespeare. What's past is prologue. In layman's terms, what that means is you don't really know where you're going unless you know where you're coming from. So at the end of World War II, the British, who at the time were the global superpower, reached a decision that the phrase, "the sun never sets on the British Empire," could no longer apply. The sun never sat on the British Empire because they had outposts all over the world. So where it was daytime one place, nighttime another place, didn't matter. The British were running the show. That was not sustainable financially or politically for the British after World War II. So in the Middle East, what ended up taking place was a power vacuum, meaning that there was no foreign power that was running the political, economic, and security infrastructure in that particular part of the world. So who stepped up to the plate? We did, the United States. We stepped up to the plate and we filled that power vacuum. And we set in place a regional security framework for the Middle East that the vast majority of Middle Eastern countries have bought into and have helped us sustain since the end of World War II. But not every country. Not every country. There are a couple of countries that haven't bought into it. Iran is one of them. Iran used to be a part of this regional security framework that we've had in place since the end of World War II. But they had a revolution in 1979, and since 1979, the past 34 years, they've not been a part of it. Other countries that are not a part of it, Syria and Lebanon. Saddam Hussein's Iraq used to not be a part of it. Gaddafi's Libya used to not be a part of it until he wasn't when the Arab Spring hit. So these things can be very fluid and they can shift. Now, at the end of the day, why would it be an issue if a country like Iran or a country like Syria, but we're talking about Iran tonight, why would it be an issue if a country like Iran said, we don't want to be a part of this regional security framework that the United States has in place? We don't want to enter into the kind of relationship with the United States that, say, Saudi Arabia has, or that Jordan has, or that Mubarak's Egypt had, or that any of the Persian Gulf countries like Kuwait, Qatar, Oman, the United Arab Emirates. Why wouldn't the Iranians want to enter into that relationship? And why should the United States care if Iran doesn't want to enter into that kind of relationship? Well, there's two reasons before we get to the nuclear issue, which is the icing on the cake. One is that if you change the rules of the game for one country, then all of the other countries start to look and say, well, why do they get it differently? It's not that different than if you have a family with multiple children in it and you treat one child differently than the other kid's going to say, well, why does he get that? Why don't I get it too, right? So you have to be consistent in your application of your regional policies towards all of your allies. If you change the rules for one, the others are going to start to take your commitments less seriously. And that's what we've done in the Middle East since World War II. We have committed to the security and the stability of the governments in that part of the world, Israel included, and we'll get to Israel in a moment. Why would we do that? What are America's interests in this part of the world? Now, remind you, I said interests, not values. We'll get to the difference between the two shortly. Our interests are the secure access to energy resources, stability in that part of the world that helps ensure the secure access to those energy resources, and the stability of the governments in that part of the world so they can ensure the stable and secure access to energy resources, right? Now, that's not to say that the United States doesn't take human rights, democracy, civil society in that part of the world seriously. I think we take it seriously all over the world, and I don't think anybody takes it as seriously as the United States does in our global application of it. But we're not perfect, just like a lot of other countries in the world aren't perfect. And the application of democracy, human rights, and civil society, it's not like a cookie cutter where you can apply it the same way to every country. So we're going to have hits and we're going to have misses, and we're seeing that now in the Arab Spring. So in the bigger scheme of things, when we have our interests on the one hand, secure access to energy resources, political stability, and on the other hand, you have our values, human rights, democracy, freedom of the press, freedom of religion. It's a constant balance between the two. And what we're working through right now in the Middle East, and what I would argue is what we've been working through in the Middle East for decades, is how do you balance the two? What do you do if the promotion of democracy, human rights, civil society, and freedoms for average innocent people conflicts with political stability that ensures your secure access to energy resources in this part of the world? What if you can't have your cake and eat it too? Well, when forced to choose, we choose our interests. Now, you can say that's right or that's wrong, but that's what we do, and we should be honest about that. And quite frankly, we shouldn't expect any other country in the world to do it much differently. If you look at what the Chinese do, you look at what the Russians do, you look at what the British, the French, the Israelis, or any other country that we do or don't get along with, they do the same thing. They prioritize their interests over the interests of others when forced to choose. Everybody wants to have their cake and eat it too, but not everybody can always get away with it. So the United States says, all right, for 34 years, the Iranian government has refused to enter into the regional security framework that we run. And now they want to develop a nuclear program? Well, there's an issue involved there. Now notice I said nuclear program. I didn't say nuclear weapon, because there's a difference between the two. There's a difference between being nuclear capable and having an actual nuclear weapon. The difference is, if you have a nuclear weapon, well, it's pretty self-explanatory. If you're nuclear capable, that means that you can develop, you have the technology and the scientific knowledge in the minds of your scientists to develop a nuclear weapon within anywhere from 1 to 5 years, should an existential national security threat come to the fore. The United States says it's an extreme cause for concern and a threat to U.S. national security if Iran has a nuclear weapon. The problem is they're pretty much nuclear capable right now. The saving grace in all of this, that Israeli intelligence, American intelligence, European intelligence says, they've not made the political decision to pursue nuclear weapons. They had a nuclear weapons program prior to 2003. They got caught cheating. And since then, they've not made the decision to pursue that path over the past 10 years. The reason why that's important is it means that there's actual deliberations inside the Iranian political system over whether or not it's in their interest to pursue those kinds of weapons. The technology, absolutely. They want to have all the pieces in place, no question, so that if they feel the national security threat dictates it, that they can pursue a bomb. There's no question that they want that. But since they've not made the political decision to do so, that opens up an opportunity. It opens up a window of time for the United States and our allies around the world to influence Iranian decision-making so that they make the choice to not build a nuclear weapon. And there's no guarantee that those efforts will work. That's the risk. It's a roll of the dice. There's no guarantee that those efforts will work. But we'll get back to that. So that's the United States issue with the Iranian nuclear program and the issue of nuclear capable versus nuclear weapon. But what about the Israelis? What about the Israelis? Why do the Israelis care about this? They already have nuclear weapons. So what's the problem? Well, when it comes to the Israeli perspective, I like to talk about the difference between rhetoric and reality, right? You see the Prime Minister of Israel going to the podium talking about the existential threat that the Iranian government presents to the Jewish state. But then on the flip side, you see quite nearly 100%, not 100%, but definitely in the 99th percentile of former Israeli security officials from Shin Bet, Mossad, the military, you name it, coming out and saying this rhetoric from the prime minister is very damaging to Israel's interests. Iran is not an existential threat. We have nuclear weapons, and there are ways to prevent the Iranian government from pursuing them. They're not irrational, they are rational. So why do we hear conflicting stories from the prime minister of Israel and the highest-ranking national security establishment officials that are recently retired? And when I say recently retired, I mean they leave office and then the next week they're saying this, which is what actually happened with the former chief of Mossad. What's the discrepancy? I would say the discrepancy is twofold. First and foremost, nobody wants another war in the Middle East, Israel included, because it's destabilizing for all at the end of the day. We learned that lesson from Iraq. Iraq adversely affected everybody's interests. Former Israeli officials, and even some current Israeli officials, will say, we think the United States made a huge mistake invading Iraq because Saddam was effectively contained. We found out after the fact that he wasn't pursuing nuclear weapons. Some people thought he was, with the benefit of 20/20 hindsight. You know what you know now, whatever, what have you. But looking ahead to Iran, these Israeli officials say there are ways to stop them short of war. And that's positive, because that means that the Israeli decision-making process can be influenced much in the same way that the Iranian can. They have a cost-benefit analysis that the United States and the European Union can seek to influence. That's always a good thing. When somebody's made up their mind and it can't be changed, that's when things get dangerous. Like in the Bush administration and the run-up to the Iraq War in 2002, 2003, they had their mind made up. Nobody was changing it. That's dangerous. But the Israeli government and the Iranian government haven't made their minds up on this issue when it comes to Iran building a bomb, the Israelis pursuing a military option, haven't made up their minds yet. But the Israelis don't see it as an issue of nuclear capable and nuclear weapon. They don't see a difference between the two. They say a nuclear capable Iran that has all of the pieces in place but does not actually move forward to construct a weapon is equally bad as the Iranians having the actual weapon itself. Well, why is that? Why would the Israelis think that if the United States doesn't see it that way? The Israelis see it that way, in their words, because since the inception of the Jewish state, 1948, Israel has had a standing policy to actively prevent any other country in the Middle East from achieving military, technological, or scientific parity with the Jewish state. What do I mean by that? Let's take Iran's nuclear program as an example, since that's what we're talking about. You've seen the cyber attacks on Iran's nuclear facilities. You've seen assassinations of Iranian nuclear scientists. This is by and large an Israeli-led process. Yes, we too are participating in it, but it's by and large an Israeli process, because they don't want Iran to achieve that military, technological, and scientific parity. But this is something that the Israeli government has been doing in this part of the world for an extended period of time. It doesn't just stem to Iran. Now, you can agree or disagree with the policy at the end of the day, right? But the fact of the matter is, this is their policy, this is what they think. So if you agree with it, if you agree with what the Israeli government is doing, that's one thing. If you disagree with it, you can't disregard what they're doing and what they think, because they're doing it and they're thinking it. So if you want them to do and think something different, you have to actively engage with them to show their interests are better suited by pursuing a different path. And that's also something that hasn't been done yet. So what do we have here? We have an Iranian government, we have an American government that says if the Iranian government has a nuclear weapons capability or a nuclear weapon, then that adversely affects the notion of a Pax Americana in the Middle East. It adversely affects this notion of you are either a part of the system that we run, or we're going to isolate you until you come around and see things our way. To sum it up, the Israelis are like, well, that's good and fine. We see where you're coming from. But our issue is we created our state based on the premise that we can't trust anybody but ourselves. And you see that play out in a lot of their policies, not just in the region, but also elsewhere. I mean, at the end of the day, if you have Israeli government officials coming to the United States, going to the podium at the AIPAC conference and saying, we can only trust ourselves, they mean it when they say it. And they're entitled to think that. That's their belief system, and if we disagree with it here in the United States, it's our job to convince them that they don't need to think that. You can't just disregard it off top. And we're going to come back to this idea of engaging ideas that you disagree with. We're going to get back to that. So at the end of the day, you have the Israeli government thinking what it thinks. You have the Iranian government thinking what it thinks. But what about, you have the United States thinking what it thinks. But what about the Iranian government? Why is the Iranian government year after year having issues either coming to the negotiating table or reaching an agreement at the negotiating table? There's a couple of different reasons. There's domestic reasons and there's foreign policy reasons. And let's unpack what some of these reasons are and see how all of these pieces kind of come together as a puzzle. Because the more things change in the Middle East, the more they stay the same. And I think Iran, Israel, and the United States are a perfect example of that. Let's go back to 9/11. After the towers were hit, one of the first governments that reached out and expressed a willingness to work with the United States was actually the Iranian government. Not the first, but one of the first. And their assistance in the process of putting together the first new government in Afghanistan after the war was critical. The American envoy at the time, who was negotiating this process, at a conference that was called the Bonn Conference in Germany, is on the record saying that at the 11th hour, these negotiations, these talks with the various groups and factions inside post-war Afghanistan was about to fall apart. And then the Iranian envoy took him in the back room, whispered something in his ear, and he came out, and he said, okay, I agree. So the Iranians kind of saved the day. Fast forward a couple of months after that, and you had President Bush's Axis of Evil speech. So the Iranians, needless to say, weren't as willing to cooperate with the United States after that speech. It's also important to note that in 1998, the Iranians themselves almost went to war with the Taliban because the Taliban abducted and killed a handful of their diplomats. So the Iranian government put hundreds of thousands of troops at the border and almost invaded. They chose not to. The reason why they chose not to, I kid you not, is because they said, well, Afghanistan is where empires go to die. With the benefit of 20/20 hindsight, maybe they weren't wrong about that. Now, 2 years after Afghanistan, Iraq happens. We invade Iraq. From 1980 to 1988, Iran fought an 8-year war with Saddam Hussein's Iraq. Less than one calendar year after the Iranian Revolution in 1979, Saddam Hussein invaded the country. They fought to a standstill for 8 years. So Iran says, let me get this straight. We almost went to war with these guys in 1998, and you removed them. We did go to war with these guys in 1988, you removed them. It kind of seems like our interests are overlapping. We should sit down and talk. So what the Iranians did was they sent a diplomatic communique through the Swiss to the United States, to the Bush administration, that said, these are your interests and aims, these are our interests and aims, here's what we're willing to trade. The Bush administration said, we don't talk to evil. Missed opportunity. Now, I highlight the missed opportunity on our end, fully acknowledging that the Iranians have their fair share of missed opportunities, particularly during the Obama administration. And we can talk a little bit about that during the Q&A, but I want to get to why they're having difficulty getting to the table and making decisions. So if you are a more reform-minded, more pragmatic-minded Iranian official who in their system, which is not democratic by any stretch of the imagination, but if you're a political insider and inside of Iran, and you're pushing for certain changes, certain foreign policy initiatives, and the two big changes that you're pushing for lead to you being included in the axis of evil, and you being told that we don't talk to evil, I think it goes without saying that you're probably going to be politically emasculated at home. And the senior leadership is not going to take your ideas and your policy prescriptions as seriously. And this is what happened to a lot of reform-minded officials in Iran at the time, right? And then when you go from 2005, when President Ahmadinejad was elected, to 2009, the domestic political situation in Iran got even worse. Now you're starting to see the overlap between foreign policy and domestic policy in Iran. Foreign policy decisions not working out, them emasculating this group of more reform-minded, pragmatic-minded officials, and then more hardline conservative officials inside of Iran smelling blood and saying, let's just get rid of these guys once and for all. And so they did. It culminated in the 2009 Iranian election, where you saw millions of people out on the streets protesting for what they felt was a stolen election. So then Obama comes into office. Mutual interest, mutual respect, we will unclench your hand, we will unclench our hand if you unclench your fist. He was saying all the right things. He sent a Persian New Year greeting, not just to the Iranian people, but to the Iranian government, referring to it as the Islamic Republic of Iran, which is technically its official name and has been since 1979, whether we like it or not. But he was doing these things to rhetorically set up an engagement strategy. But setting up something rhetorically and actually pursuing it are two very different things, right? So you cue this up, January, February, March, April, May, June, 6 months, and you haven't had any kind of diplomatic interaction with the Iranians for the first 6 months of your presidency, and then the biggest crisis in the 34-year history, I guess, 30-some-odd-year history at that time, of Iran happens. They're not in any domestic they don't have the stability at home to enter into the kind of negotiations that are going to be necessary to deliver on the promises that they make. And we actually saw that, because in late 2009, October 31, if I'm not mistaken, the United States and Iran end up sitting down in Geneva. The Russians, the Chinese, the British, the French, and the Germans were also there. And they hammered out a confidence-building measure over Iran's nuclear program. And what do I mean by confidence-building measure? I mean, the Iranians agreed to take some of their enriched uranium, the majority of it, and ship it out of the country. Because if you ship the majority of your enriched uranium out of the country, it's much more difficult to build a bomb. You can't build a bomb without the uranium. So the theory the thinking inside the Obama administration at the time was, well, if we get the uranium out of the country, that puts more time on the clock for negotiations, because that extends the amount of time that would be necessary for them to pursue a weapon and build a weapon. So the Iranians agreed to it in principle. They took it back to Tehran, and all of the president's political rivals tore him apart for agreeing to this deal. More reform-minded officials, conservative-minded officials, domestic politics prevented him from pursuing an otherwise reasonable deal. And then Iran's supreme leader, who's the shot caller in the country, saw what was happening to the president, and he removed his backing that he initially granted for the deal. So the Iranians couldn't take yes for an answer. Then you had about a year and a half of not talking. You hit 2011. The United States is in campaign mode. So what president in their right mind wants to look weak on national security by giving concessions to an authoritarian regime in the Middle East, of all places of the world? Not Obama. In 2012, we had 3 meetings with the Iranians. We asked them to do 3 things. We asked them to stop enriching uranium to the 20% level. So there's really 3 levels that you need to know if we're talking about enriching uranium. There's the 5% level, which is used for producing energy. There's the 20% level, which also is used for producing energy, medical isotopes to treat cancer patients, things of that nature. And there's 90%, which is used for weapons. The trick is going from 5 to 20, very difficult. Going from 20 to 90, much less difficult, right? So that's why the Obama administration said, we need you to stop enriching uranium to the 20% level. If you do that, that's going to put more time back on the diplomatic clock, give more time for negotiations, and we could try to sort this thing out. We also asked the Iranians to ship out the majority of their stockpile of 20% enriched uranium. Again, the thinking being, if you don't have the uranium in the country, you can't build a weapon. if you don't have the uranium in the country, it puts more time on the diplomatic clock to pursue negotiations and talk through multiple outstanding issues that these two countries have with one another. We also asked the Iranians to shut down their underground, deeply buried nuclear facility. Now, this particular nuclear facility, the Iranians did not declare. They got caught cheating, right? But then, of course, after they get caught, they declare it. There are inspectors there. We know what's going on there, right? The IAEA submits quarterly reports saying, we have inspected the facility. This is what's going on there. The reason why the United States wants the Iranians to shut down this facility is because it is immune to military strikes for all countries except the United States. So the thinking behind this goes, if we get the Iranians to shut it down, then that can calm some of Israel's concerns, because Israel does not have the bombs or the planes that would be necessary to destroy this facility on its own. The only country in the world that does is us, and we won't sell them the bombs and the planes that are necessary. They asked George Bush, he said no. They've asked Obama, he said I'll think about it. And in American politics, I think I'll think about it means I'm going to kick the can down the road and let some other president make this decision. So this is where we stand now, at the end of the day, when it comes to this issue. Now, it might seem like an intractable situation where the Israelis want one thing, the Iranians want another thing, the Americans want another thing. How can we solve this? It seems like a zero-sum game. Well, normally, I wouldn't necessarily disagree with you. The trick is, we haven't really sat down and tried to talk through these issues. True, sustained diplomacy has not taken place. A real diplomatic process has not been given a fair try. And I'm not going to sit here and tell you that if we give it a fair shake and we invest in that sustained process of diplomacy, that it can work. There's no guarantee. There's no guarantee. But what I am telling you is that if you don't invest in that process, if you don't check those boxes before you resort to military options, then is the military option really the last resort? No, it's not. I'm of the opinion, and there's a growing chorus of voices, both inside the Beltway and outside the Beltway, that are starting to say the decade of using the military, of military overextension, is done. This decade needs to be the decade of diplomacy. And what do I mean by that? Let me paint a picture for you. There are more American citizens in the American Armed Services bands than there are American diplomats. Can you believe that? There are more people in the military's marching band than there are American diplomats. The budget that the Pentagon gets absolutely dwarfs the budget that the diplomatic corps in the United States gets. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that we should or shouldn't cut the military budget, but I am going to tell you that we should boost the budget for our diplomats overseas. We should empower them the same way that we empower our armed services. And we should trust them the same way that we trust our armed services. Because when you invest in that kind of diplomatic process, there are multiple good things that could come from it. I'm going to list the three that I think are the most important. One is you get to know your adversary. Even though there's no guarantee that diplomacy can succeed, we've not sat down and spoken to the Iranians extensively, bilaterally, in over 34 years. So do we really know our adversary? Not really. Not really. This nice young lady right here, I might have heard every nasty, dirty thing about you, but if I haven't actually sat and talked to you, am I going to believe all of it? Am I going to just take at face value what I hear, or do I want to sit down and talk to you and maybe get to know you a little bit for myself to see, is it true, is it not? And if some of the things are true, are they that bad or are they not? I might want to base my opinion on my own experiences, is what I'm trying to say. And there's value in that. There's value in that. Because if the diplomatic process breaks down and you have to turn to other options, including military options, then you have a better idea of what you're dealing with. Why is that important? I bring up the example of Iraq. We pulled our diplomats out of Iraq right around the time of the first Gulf War. So from the 1990s to 2003, anywhere between 13 to 15 years. Pretty sure it's 13 years, but I'll have to double check. We didn't have diplomats on the ground. And if you don't have embassies in a country, then where do you put your intelligence analysts? Where do you put the CIA? Where do you put the spies? Where do you base them out of? What do you think? That's what we do with embassies overseas. We put spies in embassies. This is not a secret. I'm not telling you anything that people don't already know here, right? So you don't have diplomats on the ground interacting with the people of the country, taking the pulse of the Iraqi street, taking the pulse of the Iranian street, right? You have minimal intelligence analysts in the country, that are trying to figure out how can we best take care of American interests in this country, what's going on in this country's political system, what's going on in their military, what's going on with their economy, what's going on behind the headlines, because that's what intelligence is at the end of the day. It's getting information and not letting the other country know what you know, right? That's actually the most important part about intelligence, because everybody thinks we know everything, because we're the superpower. We don't know everything, but it's extremely valuable when countries don't know what we do and don't know. Keeps them on their toes. So you get information about what's going on the street. You get information about what's going on in those political systems, right? That can certainly help negotiations. What happens if you have diplomats on the ground in Tehran, and these diplomats in Tehran tell you, well, we've heard that, this political faction in Iran and that political faction in Iran, in public, they say that they agree with each other on the nuclear issue 100%. But behind closed doors, there's actually some pretty serious deliberation, and they're actually at each other's throat about how much they should agree to give up and what they should get in return, which in reality is the truth. How would you know that if you can't ground truth it? And how can you exploit divisions, which is what we do better than anyone? How can you exploit divisions if you don't know what the divisions are? Right? So there's value beyond just sitting at a negotiating table and talking. It's getting to know who you're talking to, getting to know them intimately, getting to know the systems that you're dealing with, getting to know the economies that you're dealing with, the societies that you're dealing with, so that when we have to make decisions based on war and peace, we can make them with informed information. And again, I use the reference of Iraq. This is 10 years ago. The intelligence that we had now, well, we know it wasn't very good. And we know it wasn't very good because we didn't have that many intelligence analysts, if any, in the country. We didn't have any diplomats in the country to ground truth stuff. Other countries' intelligence just usually isn't going to be as good as ours because we're the superpower. It's not to say that our British friends, our French friends, our German friends, it's not valuable. It is. But they have their own interests at the end of the day. They're not going to put American interests over their own. You'd say the same with Israel. Our intelligence sharing with Israel right now, unprecedented. We're showing them things we never would have shown them 4 or 5 years ago. And they're showing us things they never would have showed us 4 or 5 years ago. But if push comes to shove, what do you think an Israeli official is going to do? What do you think an American official is going to do if they have to choose between American interests or Israeli interests? It's not rocket science. You're going to prioritize your own country first. So we need this kind of information for our own well-good. And the diplomatic process can help ensure that. It can help succeed in getting the information that we need to make informed decisions. Now, the power of diplomacy as I see it is also an investment in the United States government as a whole. What do I mean by that? Because the diplomatic relationship between the United States and Iran broke down after the Iranian government took our diplomats hostage for 444 days, we haven't had diplomats on the ground since. But not only did we not have diplomats on the ground, we didn't have an Office of Iranian Affairs at the State Department until 2005. I was one of the first people that was in that office. So think about this. We invaded Afghanistan. We invaded Iraq. These are the 2 countries that border Iran. And we had 2 people working on Iran in one office at the State Department, and maybe a handful of others in the functional bureaus, International Security, Non-Proliferation, these other bureaus, working on it. There was no organized structure to deal with this issue. 3 whole years passed before we set that up. Now, You have a small army in the CIA working on Iran and other intelligence agencies. You have a small army at the NSA working on Iran. You have an Office of Iranian Affairs at the State Department that's 15 people deep, because we're building the institutional capacity that we need. We've set up what's called Iran Watcher posts in different Middle Eastern and European countries. So if we can't go to Iran, then we're going to send our diplomats out to the countries that have large Iranian diaspora communities or that are of great concern. Like, for example, we have an Iran Watcher in Israel, because we were trying to put together the pieces of the puzzle as best we can because we don't have people there. So the inherent value in the diplomatic process isn't just sitting down at the table, getting to know one another. It's setting up the institutional capacity that we need here in the United States government to deal with the national security issues that present themselves on a day in and day out basis. And you don't need to take my word for that. You could just look at the headlines in the news, right? The last thing I'll say, and then I want to open it up for Q&A, I don't want to ramble forever, is it doesn't have to be this way. It takes two to tango, and there's no guarantee that the Iranian government is going to come to the negotiating table and negotiate in good faith. But there are things that we can do to empower the individuals inside the Iranian system that want to pursue some kind of diplomatic agreement with the United States. Let me give you an example. The sanctions that we've put on Iran right now are the most rigorous sanctions in the history of the world. Few will argue that point. Way worse than what we've had on Cuba, way worse than what we had on Saddam Hussein, way worse than what we have on North Korea. They've been reduced to essentially barter trade. That's how the Iranians are conducting their international business now, is through bartering. How can we get Iranian officials inside their system to push for a change to their approach without offering them something in return, right? How could any American official go into a meeting at the White House and say, I think that we should offer Iran these 3 incentives, and that might do it. The first question that's going to be asked is, well, what are the Iranians offering us in return, right? That's naturally, there's a give and take that's involved in a diplomatic process. And we haven't seen a serious effort to construct symmetry in the give and take so far. In 2012, we asked the Iranians to stop doing 3 things. We offered them little to nothing in return. Now, at the time, mind you, we were saying we're making the Iranians a very credible and a very reasonable offer. But this last week in Kazakhstan, when we sat down to negotiate with the Iranians, we changed our offer, and we included more positive inducements. So if our offer was good in 2012, why do we need to change it, right? We needed to change it because Barack Obama was trying to get reelected. Let's be honest about that. Now that he's been reelected, he has more flexibility in the diplomatic process with Iran to offer tangible incentives for putting verifiable limitations on its nuclear program. Now, the Iranians are naturally going to come back with a counteroffer, but you know what? That's how the process starts. We make an offer, they make an offer. Next thing you know, you're talking. And again, I emphasize, there's no guarantee of success, but I ask everybody in this room 2 things, and I'm going to end on this note. A, consider the alternatives. If diplomacy fails, there's really only one option left, and that's war. And at the end of the day, those are really only the 2 options that exist: war and diplomacy. The dirty little secret that most people won't admit is that every war ends via negotiations. Look at what happened in Iraq. We invaded in 2003. We left in 2011. We asked them if we could stay longer. They said thanks, but no thanks. And our troops had to go. That war ended with the negotiation. Everything that happens before the negotiation, including war, is for leverage. So that when you do sit down at the negotiating table, you have as many bargaining chips as possible vis-a-vis your adversary. So I ask you to consider this. Consider the alternative to diplomacy. It's war. And consider the fact that we as a country have not had a dialogue about what it would mean to go into another war in the Middle East. Our government hasn't prepared us for it. We haven't had the discussion, and it's eerily reminiscent to what happened in the run-up to the Iraq War. I don't think the Obama administration wants to go to war. I actually believe the Obama administration wants to solve this thing peacefully. But until we have a discussion as a country to weigh the pros and cons of making that decision, I'm of the view that it's an irresponsible decision to make. I'm hopeful that the diplomatic process will continue and it will bear fruit. There's no guarantee, but I have considered the alternative, and it's not looking good. So I'm going to stop there. Hopefully I can answer your questions. Thank you so much for listening. I appreciate it. Take my jacket off.
Thank you very much, Reza. That was very, very engaging, very, very interesting. We've got 2 mics here. Are there any questions? Can we hear you from there?
Would you follow up as to the events of today?
The events of today, the APAC conference?
There was an announcement that Iran was willing to discuss or negotiate.
Oh, yes. Okay. So in the news today, there was one Iranian official said that they would be willing to sit down with the U.S. bilaterally, one-on-one, and have negotiations. But he added the typical Iranian caveat, saying, we won't do it under pressure, or as the supreme leader of Iran says, we won't do it while you have the gun to our head. So there's a bit of rhetoric in this, right? Because it makes the Iranians look good to the international community, saying, of course we'll sit down and talk, but we won't do it if you continue to sanction us, threaten us with war, and things like that. So will these bilateral talks happen between the United States and Iran on the sidelines of the broader international negotiations that are taking place? I hope so. The ball is in the Iranians' court. I have a hard time seeing it in the foreseeable future unless there's more of a give and take between the two countries. It's not outside the realm of possibility. It happened once in 2009, and I think that's actually what spurred the initial agreement on the confidence-building measure that took place. I'll keep my fingers crossed, but I think right now it's more rhetoric than reality. Sure.
I won't say anything else. Do you think that there was limitations as to Hillary Clinton as Secretary of State being female versus male as to Obama communication?
It's a great question. That's a great question. Let's unpack that. Now, I want to be clear that I'm speaking my personal opinion. Yeah, I do think that the U.S. government is an old boys club. I do. And I think that's unfortunate, but I also think it's changing because there are so many talented women across the spectrum in the U.S. government now, not only in the Foreign Service, but in the intelligence services, in the military, in the Commerce Department, you name it. So it's changing, and that's good, but it takes time. Just like most change that happens in this country, it doesn't happen overnight. So I do think that there were some limitations. Now, the second part of what I would say when it comes to this issue of the limitations would be she agreed to take the position of Secretary of State on the condition that she could have regular one-on-one meetings with the president, which is smart on her part, because the president is surrounded by 1,000,001 people who think they're the smartest person in the world, right? So you're competing for the president's time. And she got regular one-on-one meetings with him, and you could see that over the course of his presidency, he started to listen to her more and more. In my humble opinion, probably not as much as he should have, but better late than never.
We have a text question that came in. We have a couple, actually.
Sure.
The first one is, how do you know that Iran does not have the bomb, and shouldn't Israel be included in talks with Iran?
Great questions. I trust the assessment that is shared by the United States, Israel, Europe, and pretty much every other developed country that are both diplomatic assessments, political assessments, and intelligence assessments that say that Iran does not have the bomb. I can't tell you that I've been in their nuclear facilities and I've seen, oh, everything but the bomb. No, I haven't seen that. But our intelligence is pretty good, and I trust it. And the Israelis' intelligence is really good, too, and I trust that. Same with the Europeans. So that's why I'm confident that they do not have a bomb, because pretty much the international community agrees that they don't. The second question was, I'm sorry, remind me.
Let me pull it back up.
Sure. Oh, yeah, including Israel. I'm of the opinion the more the merrier, but I'm also realistic. I don't think the Israelis would want to join the talks, and I don't think the Iranians would want the Israelis to join the talks. Why? I think that the Israelis believe, some Israelis, I shouldn't say all, I think this government, the Netanyahu government, thinks that international interaction with this Iranian government legitimizes it. Now, you can have an argument about whether or not foreign countries, be it the United States, Israel, or anyone else, can legitimate a foreign country. That's all in the eye of the beholder. But this is their view. They think it, right? So I'm doubtful that they would want to join at this stage. I also don't think that they would want to join because the Iranian government says some pretty horrible things about Israel. So I think we have some massaging of the relationship that would need to be done before those kinds of conversations take place, conversations that would involve the Iranians and the Israelis at the same time. There are back-channel talks that take place. You know, it's not a complete and utter break in communication between the Iranians and the Israelis. And, you know, there's numerous instances over the past 20, 30 years that demonstrate that, Iran-Contra being the most prominent one, right? So probably not anytime soon. And I don't think that the Iranians would want the Israelis to enter the talks because the Iranians benefit from having rhetoric and actions that are seen in the Middle East as anti-Israel. Israel's not popular in the Middle East. I don't think that's a secret to anyone, right? And as a result of that, two things happen. One, you have an Israeli government that says, you know, we can't trust anybody but ourselves. And Israel does have very real and legitimate security interests, and I understand that, right? But the Iranians benefit in the Arab world by being seen as the resistance, leading this resistance to Israel, right? Trying to right the wrongs and, you know, bring justice to where there is injustice and all the other rhetoric that they use. So at the end of the day, do they really care about the Palestinians? Probably not. I don't think so. I think it's the way that they're able to increase their leverage and their prestige in the region. Nothing more, nothing less. And because of what's happening in Syria now, and the Iranian government backing the Assad regime, this narrative that the Iranians like to use of being anti-Israel and therefore, you know, we are at the forefront of resistance and we are a prominent Middle Eastern country, a regional power, it's taking a really significant blow. Because on the one hand, if you're supporting social justice, political justice, economic justice for the Palestinians and for other countries that are maybe opposed to what Israel's doing, and yet you're backing the Assad government as it butchers its own people, there's a bit of a discrepancy there, right? So I think now more than ever, you have a region, you have the Middle East, people in this part of the world that aren't really buying what the Iranians are selling. Now more than ever, you're starting to see that. Sure. Is that okay? Yeah.
Thank you very much for your perspective and the insightful history and the developments since World War II, which actually goes beyond that. But there are, I think, three other points
Sure.
that should also be mentioned here. Perhaps time didn't allow that. Point number one is up to 1975, the United States actually had a contract with the government of Iran, which was under the Shah's regime at the time, to develop nuclear capability beyond just nuclear power as a resource, as a source of energy for the country, but far beyond that. When the diplomatic relationship between the two countries became gradually sour and the administration, U.S. administration saw less and less hope in stability in Iran, which of course they were right, they pulled back. Germans stepped in, they took a whole billions of dollars of money, they pulled back. French stepped in, they pulled back. Russians came in. So since 75, there's been probably for about 20 years, that has been tens of billions of dollars that's been swallowed up with four different strong developing nations that came in and they took the money and delivered nothing. So the Iranian government said, we can't trust this, we got to do it on our own. So whether right or wrong, I think that perspective should also be placed in this conversation. Number two is that when we can't hear. Go to the mic. By popular demand. Where shall I start from? The beginning or where?
Let me sum up the first part. The first part was he pointed out the fact that the Iranians have had nuclear agreements with no less than 3 countries.
Actually, 4.
Actually 4, and those countries have not followed through on their end of the bargain. And that's true. And it's worth noting.
Right. And it's been United States, France, Germany, and former Soviet Union, Russia.
Yeah.
And throughout that process, the Iranian government has lost tens of billions of dollars without delivery of anything, even nuclear power as a source of energy for the country, not to discuss any other aspect of it. The other component that I think should also be mentioned is that the duality that the United States presents itself and the way it supports various nuclear developments throughout the country. It actively pursued and supported India in developing nuclear power and nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
Just two nations over there, then it says, no, you cannot do this. Meanwhile, we are going to attack your neighbor here, we're going to attack your neighbor here. And not only that, any resource that they have, we want to pull it out of the country. Again, whether it's right or wrong, any of these issues can be subject of discussion. And thirdly, when superpowers, they come in and they say, United States, for example, has over 11,000 nuclear warheads.
Mm-hmm.
Israel, I believe, has over 220, if I'm not mistaken, or something around there. You probably know that better than I do. When these powers, they come, they say, we can have hundreds, if not thousands of nuclear warheads, but you cannot even pursue any program that goes in that direction. Whether the country is Iran, whether the country is Korea, or wherever else you want to look at it, I think that creates a huge hegemony, and if not an imbalance, in the way you're trying to present yourself and you say, okay, this is the perspective I have of you, this is what I want you to do or not to do, now you come and sit at the bargaining table with me. Having said these three issues, I don't think Iranian government is without its faults. My gosh, do they ever have problems? And
Sure.
they have missed plenty of opportunities that they could have improved the dialogue, not only between the two countries, but also for the nation themselves. And I was interested about your perspective on that. And I'll take my answer sitting down.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. I hope everybody heard what this gentleman said, because these are important points. And all of these points go back to this idea that I referred to earlier in my talk when I said, people in Iran think these things. And we can disagree with them if we want, or we can think it's not reasonable, or we can think it's not rational, but that doesn't negate the fact that it exists. So you can disregard it, and you can make no progress at the diplomatic table, because if you ignore the interests of the people that you're sitting across from, you're not going to get very far in a negotiation. Or you can seek to understand what they think and why they think it, and then by extension, how you can get their views and their opinions to shift, right? So yes, the Iranian government has legitimate grievances, there's no doubt about that, and I think you did a great job of outlining what a lot of those grievances are when it comes to its nuclear program, when it comes to the regional balance of power, when it comes to changing the rules of the game as it applies to different countries. All of these things are true, they happen. No doubt about it, no doubt about it. Going forward, I think the way that you get past a lot of this is, let me say it like this, the ghosts of history are always going to be in the room when the United States and Iran sit down and try to negotiate. There's no doubt about that. And more often than not, both sides enter the diplomatic room and they list their various grievances, even though they already know that the other side is aware of them, right? I'm of the opinion that it's going to take leaders in both countries that are willing to take risks for peace. That doesn't mean that they ignore what's happened in the past, but there is going to have to be some kind of acknowledgement that not only these things happened, whether it's the hostage crisis or support for the Shah or the nuclear deal with India or any of the other points that you made, all of which are valid. But if we focus on the injustices that each side did to one another, rather than acknowledging them and figuring out how to make them not insurmountable, right, and focus on the future instead of the past, we're going to have a big problem on our hands. Because focusing on what has been done, we can get caught up in that for ages and ages and ages. And I don't want to understate its importance. It's very, very important. History matters. The past matters. What's past is prologue, right? No doubt about it. And again, there's no guarantee that talking through these things in a sustained fashion can help us overcome. There's no guarantee that diplomacy will produce success. No, absolutely not. Anybody that tells you that is not being honest. But again, you have to try. You have to give it a fair shake. You have to engage in the process in a sustained fashion, which we do in the vast majority of the world with other countries, before we consider what's supposed to be the last resort, right? I can guarantee you that the Iranians don't want a war. The vast majority of the Iranian government doesn't want a war. I mean, think about it. The Iranian government is in a very precarious position, largely of its own doing, but not entirely. Here they're in a position where if they move too far in their nuclear program, they lose their heads. But if they don't move far enough in their nuclear program, they lose face at home. So they're in this strange gray area where they take one step forward, 2 steps back, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. I would argue that that's not sustainable over the long run, because even if they continue to advance the technical aspects of their program, they're inevitably going to hit a point in their program where the technical aspects that they've accomplished are not to the liking of either Israel or the United States, and then there's going to be a problem. That's another reason why I think talking through this as soon as possible, before they continue to create more facts on the ground on their end, and we continue to create more facts on the ground on our end as it pertains to the sanctions and the various other forms of pressure, cyber warfare, assassinations, these kinds of things. The longer this stuff continues, the more the law of unintended consequences kicks in. And a military conflict that both sides would independently seek to avoid can happen when you least expect it. You can stumble into a war. In fact, that's probably the most likely way that it would shake out if the status quo sustains itself, because neither side is pursuing it right now. Sure.
I spent 4 years in Iran in the 1970s as a
Great.
Farsi-speaking junior foreign service officer.
Thank you for your
And
service.
one of the things that really was a problem during that time is that the United States government was so sold on the need for the Shah to be the stability in the Middle East and to really be our ally in that area, that Washington and senior people in the embassy were not very interested in learning about some of the suspicions and concerns that some of the junior officers had. I mean, for example, there were several of us that did a large paper on corruption in Iran and how the Shah's family was involved in a great deal of this corruption. And it never went anywhere, I'm sorry to say. And so there were these kind of problems. Also, of course, Savak, the secret police, would follow diplomats. We had a hard time. I was in Tabriz for a couple of years. A very hard time getting to know people because you knew you were being followed. And I'm just wondering, I mean, these are things that are not new. You know these very well. But are we ready to have diplomats on the ground in Iran to really tell Washington, is Washington really ready to believe or ready to listen to what they might have to say about what the Iranian people really think, if in fact the Savak equivalent today will allow them to get into society and to report accurately on what the people think?
It's a great question. Thank you for asking that question. And again, thank you for your service. It's not every day that you get to meet an American diplomat that served in Iran, so that's kind of a treat for me. I'd answer the question in 2 ways. I would answer it from the Iranian side, and I'll answer it from the American side. On the Iranian side, I don't think that they would treat our diplomats any differently than the way that you were treated if you were to go back, because a lot of my friends that work for European governments that are diplomats in Tehran, yeah, they get followed, they get watched, but they still do their reporting. And they're still able to write those papers on corruption of some of the more prominent families or some of the elites within the political system. But just because you write a paper doesn't mean that it's going to get read in Washington or Brussels or whatever your respective capital is, as you so eloquently said. So then that goes to the next part of your question, which is Washington ready to hear what its officials are saying? And my answer is it depends on who in Washington we're talking about. Congress, absolutely not. It goes without saying. That's why they have an 11% approval rating. But Barack Obama has a reputation of reading every piece of paper that comes on his desk. I mean, I've heard stories from, I'll use a story from Afghanistan and Pakistan. One of my former colleagues that worked on this issue said that he was surprised to hear the president reference something about Afghanistan and Pakistan that was in an obscure memo that he wrote. And the reason why he knew it was his memo was because everybody else in his office disagreed with what he wrote in the memo. So the only way the president could have known that is A, if he come up with it on his own, which isn't going to happen because he's not an expert on the issue, or if he read the memo. And you hear these stories all the time of Barack Obama reading everything, right? So is it analysis by paralysis? To a certain extent, sure. But his willingness to read everything and consider everything isn't shared by the national security circle around him. And yes, that's problematic. And you see this not just on Iran today or the Iran of yesteryear, but you see this on a lot of Middle Eastern countries. And I'm not trying to knock the United States here. I'm trying to be honest to say we can do better. We're not doing horribly, but we can do better. We didn't see the Arab Spring coming. Why? It's not true that we didn't see the Arab Spring coming. Numerous diplomatic cables, you can go on WikiLeaks and see them now. We're talking about this kind of stuff. Absolutely. But you never hear that in the media. You don't hear it in the news. You don't hear our politicians going to the podium talking about this kind of stuff. Why? Because it goes back to our interests and our values. What our diplomats are ground truthing, what our intelligence analysts are ground truthing in these countries, yes, absolutely. We have enough information to be able to say these are our values. We can come up with policy ways to perhaps shift the paradigm and balance our interests and our values. But that takes political courage at home to do. And we don't have a lot of politicians that have been willing to take those risks, right? I'm hopeful that Barack Obama will take some of those risks in his second term. But I'm hopeful is exactly that, hopeful. So I hope we see more of it, because if we don't, we're going to continue to be caught flat-footed on a lot of this stuff when we have the information available so that we shouldn't be caught flat-footed. That's my take. Thank you.
Do you have any idea what the Iranian people's image of the United States is, and also what their opinion is of their own government? Because sometimes it's hard to tell.
It's an important question, and a really, really good one. We'll start with what the Iranian people think of the United States. There are a lot of people who say that the Iranian people are the most pro-American people in the Middle East. I would say it a little bit differently. I would say they're the least anti-American. There's a fundamental difference between the two. We laugh, but there's a fundamental difference between the two. Because pro-American means, we want the Levi's, the Coke, and everything else you're throwing our way. But Iranians don't want everything we're throwing their way. They're very critical of our invasion of Iraq. Deeply, deeply critical of our invasion of Iraq, right? They didn't like that. And then what did that do? That caused a number of Iranians, I'm not going to sit here and say a majority, because even though I was there at the time, there's no way that I can sit here and tell you I polled every single Iranian in this percent. No, I couldn't do that. But you would hear at dinner parties, you would hear in taxi cabs, are they just doing this to expropriate energy resources from Iraq? Are they just doing this for the oil, right? You would hear that stuff, just like, no, they're not just doing it for the oil. But these conspiracy theories have a propensity to take on a life of their own, right? Particularly in a country that has the history that Iran has with the United States, where we did back an authoritarian Shah who, was kind of our guy, for lack of a better term. So I think that there is a huge reservoir of goodwill that Iranians inside of Iran have towards the United States. My concern is that as sanctions intensify and as they're in place for an extended period of time, that reservoir of goodwill is going to dwindle. Because I'm talking to Iranians in Iran right now, they don't like the sanctions. But that's just it. Iranians are capable of thinking two thoughts simultaneously. They don't like being adversely affected by the United States or the European Union, but they also don't like the way that their own government is treating them. So no, I don't think that this Iranian government is deeply popular throughout society. I don't. I do think that prior to 2009, you would hear Iranians across the political and social spectrum complain about the economic situation in the country and really criticize this regime. And since 2009, it's only intensified because their political management of the country has been atrocious. And that carries over into the economic and to the social as well. The sanctions exacerbate all of this, right? So Iranians are savvy enough to be able to blame everybody that needs to be blamed for what they need to be blamed for. That's my take. I don't think that tomorrow this reservoir of goodwill that exists in Iran towards America is going to just be gone like that. No. But I do think over time, if the longer that these sanctions are in place, we're going to continue to see that goodwill dissipate. And you don't need to take my word for it, because there are historical examples that show sanctions that are in place against countries not only stunt democratic transition, but it also increases nationalism in these countries. And that's a pretty combustible combination. Thanks.
Let's take, there's 3 questions here and then one from the text.
Fantastic. Okay. Yeah, absolutely.
You mentioned WikiLeaks. So how do leaking organizations change the calculus of policy, especially when we're talking about doing diplomacy with a culture that values face saving so deeply?
Good question. I was very anti-WikiLeaks. And the reason why I was anti-WikiLeaks is because of how it impacts American diplomacy in a really bad way. The whole reason why people are willing to talk to our diplomats is because they're able to do it in an anonymous way, where even if their name is included in the diplomatic reporting, because we're not sharing that diplomatic reporting with anyone else, it won't get back to anybody else that they're having these candid conversations with the United States. Particularly when you're in more authoritarian countries, which is pretty much the entire Middle East, if political leaders find out that you're having these kind of candid conversations with the United States, that puts you in danger. So, and it also puts American diplomats in danger as well. And it makes it really difficult to send American diplomats back to those countries if those particular countries didn't much like the conversations that were being had. So there's a reason why things are classified, particularly diplomatic cables. Classifying diplomatic cables are not to keep information from the American people, right? It's to protect the people that are willing to have those conversations with us and to protect our diplomats that are serving overseas. I think if you have issues with transparency in government, there are much better ways to address that issue than leaking diplomatic cables and putting innocent people at risk. But that's just my personal opinion, and I understand that some people disagree with that. The second part of your question was face saving. I think WikiLeaks, does make it harder to save face. But let me give you an example. I was talking to an Iranian official, and he told me, he's like, well, who cares about this WikiLeaks? Sure, I can read some stuff, but most of the stuff you were able to figure out on your own. And I'm like, well, clearly you haven't read through the cables because there's a lot of stuff in there. But I'm like, well, what do you mean? What's the big deal? And he says to me, look, at the end of the day, the United States is going to lie to certain countries are going to lie to the United States, and then they're going to go in front of the cameras and they're going to pretend like it's all hunky-dory. Sometimes that's true, but sometimes it's not. And that's where the face saving kicks in, right? So does American credibility take a hit because of WikiLeaks? Absolutely. A, it makes us look like we can't keep a secret. B, people can actually see what we're saying on our own private reporting and compare it to what we're saying in what was actually said in those meetings, right? So if an American official, let's say an American official is meeting with the Saudi king, and we're having a conversation, and then the reporting of what happened in that meeting is going to be very different than what actually happened in the meeting, right? I mean, that's the whole idea of diplomacy. You don't show your entire hand. So, it handcuffs us in a lot of ways in that sense, and it makes it much harder to save face because it hurts our credibility, in my view. That answer the question?
Well, I guess the question was more to, it's a reality on the ground, so how do we deal with it? Because whether we like it or not, it's happening.
Yeah. Well, the reality on the ground is going to happen no matter what, right? So the diplomatic reporting that we do is all about getting people to talk to us about what's happening on the ground. And WikiLeaks makes those people maybe a bit more skeptical or a bit more cautious in the way that they have conversations with us. Hopefully that won't be permanent, but I think I've talked to more than a few American diplomats that say that they've noticed the tangible change. Granted, I've talked to some that say they haven't noticed any change. But if even some are noticing that kind of change, then I do think that does adversely affect our ability to collect the information happening on the ground in real time that can inform the policy-making decision back in Washington. Yeah, I do. That answer the question a little bit better? Great. Who was next? I know you. For those of you who don't know, this was my former intern in Washington, D.C.
All right, so I've got a couple questions for you, Reza, about, I guess, maybe tying some of the themes together that we talked about, and then a little bit forward-looking, too. So one of the things we talked about was the ties between, or I guess the dichotomy between rhetoric versus reality. And we talked a little bit about that on the Israeli politics side, and I was wondering if we could talk about that looking at the Iranian side, especially because you referenced some of the comments Ahmadinejad has made. and then how that might be impacted by the June 2013 Iranian presidential elections. Question number 2 is that we also talked about the different ways that you could empower reform movements or reformists within the Iranian political system. And Israel has a coalition system for their government, and so you have like people like Tzipi Livni, who are obviously very different than Bibi Netanyahu. So are there things that the U.S. policy could be doing to empower those types of aspects in the Israeli coalition? And then I guess the final question is, if you get people to the table, what should sustained legitimate diplomacy look like as opposed to rote, box checking off a form? And then what should the role of multilateralism and international organizations be in this process?
It's my former intern. Great questions. I mean, so let's unpack them one by one. And we can, if I happen to forget what one of the questions was, I'll have you repeat. So rhetoric versus reality on the Iranian end was question number 1. I think there's definitely a difference between the Iranian government's rhetoric and the reality behind their policy making and the actions that they take. That doesn't excuse the rhetoric, though, first and foremost. I mean, these guys say some pretty atrocious stuff on a regular basis, and we should all acknowledge that for what it is. And it's not productive, and it makes it much more difficult for those of us in the United States and our European friends to go to the Israelis and say, but we need to talk it out, right? Makes it much more difficult. There's no question about that. But on the flip side, right, we talk about Mr. Ahmadinejad and his comments. So 2005, or no, it was 2006 or 2007, he made the famous wipe Israel off the map comment, right? Which, still gets repeated to this day. But last year in 2012, the deputy prime minister of Israel went on Al Jazeera and said, yeah, he didn't really say that. We just, there were different translations of what he said. We rolled with the one that would help us with what we needed to accomplish at the time. And, Mr. Ahmadinejad repeating it over and over again certainly didn't help matters, right? It's like having a fire and saying, let me throw some gasoline on it. Right. So, again, doesn't excuse the fact that they say this stuff. But do their actions match the rhetoric? No. I think their rhetoric, again, goes back to what I was saying earlier about trying to look like the beacon of hope for the Palestinians, working against the unjust Israeli cause, blah, 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 all this stuff that they say. But they do put forward some actions that are diametrically opposed to American interests and Israeli interests as well. There's no doubt about that. The question that we have to ask ourselves is, why do they do it, right? There's been an ebb and flow in what the Iranian government has done when it comes to their destructive behavior, the destructive actions that they take vis-a-vis the United States and Israel. And if you get into a chicken and egg argument of who started it, then you're missing the whole premise of the point, which is it's going on right now. How do we get it to stop, right? Like, if somebody in Israel or the United States needs me to say the Iranians started it, fine, the Iranians started it. Can now we talk about what's going on now and figure out how to stop it? If an Iranian official needs me to say the Israelis and the Americans started it, fine, they started it. Now can we talk about what's going on now and figure out how to stop it? Do you know what I'm saying? So at the end of the day, no question, the Iranians have attempted to commit bombings in numerous countries against Israeli citizens over the last calendar year. No doubt about it. They've allegedly committed cyber attacks against the biggest Saudi oil company and the biggest natural gas company in the world in Qatar over the past calendar year. They have, well, let's use those examples, right? Let's use those examples. So they've done this, and they've continued to advance the technical aspects of their nuclear program as well in provocative ways. Now, why are they doing these things? Are these things independent of what's going on in the rest of the world? Or are they part of a cycle of mutual escalation? I would argue the latter. Because what have we been doing? We've been assassinating their nuclear scientists. We've been committing cyber warfare against their nuclear facilities. We've been sanctioning them. So again, the chicken and the egg argument is less relevant than we are locked in a cycle of mutual escalation. Both sides are running out of escalatory options. The remaining escalatory options are increasingly dangerous. And as your remaining escalatory options get increasingly dangerous, if you choose to enact them, that could spark a war that quite frankly, you didn't intend to start. So that's why I say, okay, great, they started it, whatever. Let's figure out how to stop it. That's my primary concern when it comes to Iranian rhetoric versus their actual actions. They're doing horrible stuff, but we should also acknowledge that we're doing stuff that they don't like, and we should figure out, all right, if you, the Iranians, want us to stop doing this stuff, then we're going to have to ask you to stop doing this stuff. And then we have to test their willingness to stop. So that's that question. Your next question was, remind me.
So we talked about the empowering reformists within the Iranian political system.
Right.
Israel has a coalition government, and you have elements of that coalition that are very different than the line that Bibi Netanyahu puts out. So are there things that the U.S. could be doing in its relationship with Israel to empower some of those aspects of the Israeli coalition government?
Yes and no. I don't think that this is a centrist government in Israel. I still think it's a government that's to the right, even though Mr. Netanyahu doesn't have as many seats as he did in the prior. And he actually just asked for more time to form the government as well. So that means he's having a bit of an issue putting together the coalition that he needs. But at the end of the day, the public opinion that exists, he's still pretty popular in Israel at the end of the day. So that means the ideas that he has are relatively popular. So you have people like Livni and the other people coming in to the coalition. Can you influence them in certain ways? Sure. So let me give you an example. There's unanimity in Israel on the issue of sanctions on Iran. You don't hear too many people that are part of Mr. Netanyahu's coalition saying, we should trade some of these sanctions for concessions from the Iranians. At least they're not saying it publicly. And it remains to be seen whether or not they'll start to say it privately, but they have to actually enter into the government. A government has to be formed before you can see whether or not those divisions exist and how you can potentially take advantage of them if you're an American policymaker. But if we can only go off of what we know, right? And if we look at the way that Mr. Obama has handled the relationship with Israel, not the rhetoric, but what's actually been done, I think a case can be made that no president in the last 20 to 30 years has done more for Israel than Barack Obama. And I also understand that there's a lot of people that will disagree with that statement. But if you look at what we're sharing with them now in terms of intelligence, in terms of military hardware, in terms of aid, in terms of protecting them at the United Nations, just a laundry list of things that we provide them, we have their back. And that's the president's own words, right? And whether or not that shifts going forward remains to be seen, because the issues that caused Mr. Obama to take the positions that he took vis-a-vis Israel all exist today, with the exception of one thing: he's not trying to get reelected. Now, the fact that he's not trying to get reelected needs to be juxtaposed with the political reality that Congress is what Congress is, right? So, and the Republicans are going to lambaste him every chance they get if he's perceived to be weak on Israel. So, rather than him trying to take advantage of divisions that exist within the Israeli political system, which Bill Clinton did masterfully, in my view, I don't think he'll try to do that as much as he'll try to have a dialogue with the entire Israeli system to try and say, look, we're of the opinion that this is in your best interest. Hear us out. You're free to disagree with us. You probably will. But hear us out anyway. That's what I think that's going to happen when it comes to Israel.
And then the last aspect of the kind of large question was, say you get people to the negotiating table, and you and NIAC advocate for sustained and legitimate diplomacy. So what would that, or what should that look like, as opposed to rote, checking off the boxes before something else? And then what should the role of multilateralism and international organizations be in that process?
I hit the microphone, sorry. A sustained diplomatic process usually takes, 1, 2, 3 years to play out in its entirety. So rather than trying to solve everything in one meeting, I'm of the opinion that we should focus on tangible confidence-building measures that can put time on the clock for diplomacy to carry forward. That's going to require the Iranians to put verifiable limitations on the amount of uranium they enrich, the level to which they enrich it, and the operational structure of their underground nuclear facility. Now, notice I didn't get specific on any of those things. The reason why I didn't is because that's what needs to be negotiated. Now, in return, the United States is going to have to offer some form of sanctions relief. It's going to have to determine at what point in time we want to acknowledge Iran's right to enrich uranium on Iranian soil. Most people will agree privately that this cat's out the bag. The Iranians are going to continue to enrich on their soil to the 5% level no matter what. The trick is, when do you acknowledge it at the United States? The worry is, if we acknowledge it now, they'll pocket that concession and then they won't be as interested in continuing the negotiation. So we should save it to the end. I'm of the opinion that I get where you're coming from, but if you save it till the end, they're not going to take you seriously. Show me an example of a concession that the Iranians have pocketed. I can show you a ton of examples that we've pocketed. I can only think of a handful that the Iranians have pocketed. It mostly happened in the 80s. Now, if I'm wrong about that, I'm happy to be proven wrong, right? But that's going to be the give and take when it comes to the confidence building measure. But the nuclear issue isn't the only issue of contention between Iran and the United States. So you're going to have to start talking about other issues as well. The Iranians are willing to talk about other issues because they understand that if we start to talk to them about what's going on in Syria or Bahrain or the Arab Spring or these other issues, we are quote-unquote legitimizing their role in the region. We are basically saying these problems, you can't solve these problems as Iran on your own, but we can't solve them without you. And we don't want to acknowledge that. Why? Because they don't enter into the regional security architecture that we've set up since the end of World War II. And if we change the rules for Iran, then other countries are going to say, well, wait a minute, why are we saying how high when you tell us to jump when you just changed the rules for the Iranians? So I'm of the opinion you start small and you work your way towards these other things after you've built a little bit of trust, because neither side trusts one another. So that's the way that I see the diplomatic process playing out in the short to medium term. And I think that's what we have to focus on now, because quite frankly, the Iranians haven't made a firm decision on what kind of relationship they want to have with us over the long run. And we haven't made a decision on what kind of relationship we want to have with the Iranians in the long run. Is our policy regime change? Is our policy behavior change? Big difference between the two. And our policy needs to reflect that, because right now it's a bit schizophrenic, where it's a little bit of both. We're trying to split the difference, and it doesn't work that way. You got to choose. I think that answers that question. Yeah, did I leave out part of it?
Multilateralism.
Oh, multilateralism, sure. I'm of the opinion the more talking, the better. The more talking, the better. Iran had a good track record of interacting with the United Nations, the World Bank, and other international organizations in the 1990s and early 2000s. That kind of went down the tube with Mr. Ahmadinejad. But the fact of the matter is, Iran has conflicts with other countries, but the real issue here is the US-Iran conflict, in my view. And Iran's not going to be able to fully solve the conflicts that it has with other countries in the world until this issue with the United States gets fully resolved. So the United States and Iran are going to have to start talking directly. And again, I think the ball is in Iran's court on this issue. Like, I get where they're coming from, where you don't want to project weakness and have a bilateral discussion while you're being sanctioned and isolated and things of that nature. But it's reaching a point now where the alternative is becoming more risky. So yes, the United States and Iran are going to have to talk bilaterally. It's valuable to have the discussions on a multilateral setting because there's no trust between the United States and Iran. So bringing in outside actors that both parties trust can help inject some trust into a process that's otherwise devoid of it. Who is next?
I think we're going to wind up the questions. There have been more questions this evening than we've had for our speakers, which means it's been a very stimulating conversation. Thank you so much for being here with us. Let's give them a round of applause.
Thank you.